All right, it's coming up this Tuesday, October the 4th on Vice TV, 10 o'clock Eastern Time. The 10-episode season starts of Tales from the Territories. And obviously, it is Tales from the Territories, featuring folks that were in those territories and shot by the guys that almost brought an end to a few careers with their last season of Dark Side of the Ring. And we think that this one will be received just as well, if not better. Evan Husney and Jason Eisner, the creators behind Dark Side of the Ring and now Tales from the Territories. Thanks, guys, for being on the show.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks for having us back.
And I guess we should assign, for the folks who haven't heard you speak before, Evan, you say something so they get a load of your voice, since we got two guests today.
All right. This is Evan right here, and thanks for the comic books I bought from you, Jim, last time I was there. I appreciate that.
And thank you for the rare wrestling encyclopedia that you just sent me when you sent back the pictures that I sent you to scan. And Jason, say hello to the folks as well.
Yeah. Hey, everyone. This is Jason Eisner. And Jim, it's been a long time since I've seen you as well, too. I've missed out on the last couple trips.
I know you don't come down here anymore. Is it a problem with the border or what's going on?
No, I'm like always, I get serious FOMO. I'm so jealous when I see the guys are there. I'm blocked. I'm chained to a computer, like working nonstop 24/7. So, we've had to split up duties as the shows have gotten bigger and more shows are being made.
Well, I thought that actually it was usually problems on the other way crossing the border. When you got a record like you've got, it's harder to get from the States back into Canada. But nevertheless, how did you guys get in the Tales from the Territories business? Dark Side of the Ring has been the biggest hit on Vice TV for its 3 seasons.
Yeah.
But this is it's still the wrestling genre, but it's a departure both in style and tone and content. How did this episode or this series idea come up?
Well, it was actually back in 2019 when this first started. It was right after the first season of Dark Side of the Ring had finally aired. And I just remember, I think episode 1 or 2 had just dropped. And I was, I think, at the grocery store. I looked down at my phone and I got a notification that said The Rock has mentioned you on Twitter, which was like, oh shit, what is this? And I looked down, and of course it was The Rock, had just seen the first few episodes of Dark Side, and he, took the time out just to, tweet us to put over the show, and it was amazing. It was like this thing I never thought in a million years would ever happen. And of course that had just come off the heels of Hulk Hogan burying us on Twitter right after the first episode had aired. So it was like this weird, we're like at WrestleMania 18 all over again. But it was cool. And so from there, just organically, it was sort of like our people and The Rock's people sort of got together to talk like, hey, maybe there's something we could do together. Maybe there's another show or another wrestling doc we could do. And we already had the, second season of Dark Side in development. So we were working on that. And it was obviously, we want to try and think of something that we could do that was completely different. So we met with $7 Productions, which is The Rock's film and TV production company. And we just started talking, and it was quick. It was quick, that we decided that we had a mutual interest in wanting to do something around the territories or that era. So we started spitballing ideas. I sort of went home after that, meeting and just was just thinking of different ways we could format a show around the territories that wasn't like an exhaustive history of each territory, something that just allowed us the platform to bring, these wrestlers together to tell crazy, wild, weird stories, like truly insane stories. Because we've heard, like, Jason and I have heard so many of these wild road stories, if you will, from back in those days. And the territory era is usually a catalyst to some pretty wild shit because, as you know, and I'm sure everybody listening, it's, back when fans believed, and kayfabe is at just an ultra, is super enforced. And that just raises the stakes of like everything, of having to live your gimmick 24/7. So wrestlers, especially the heels, would get into some pretty wild scenarios. And we'd heard a lot of these anecdotes along the way making the show, and obviously read about them in books and shoot interviews. So we wanted just a platform for these crazy, 5-minute punchy stories that we could reenact. And long story short, while we
Too
were
late.
I know, I'm sorry. while we were developing season 2, we were working on the Chris Benoit episodes of Dark Side. We had met Chavo Guerrero Jr., who was really instrumental in putting those shows together. And he also was sort of transitioning over into into more TV productions. He was working on Glow, and we just hit it off with Chavo. And he also had some interest in wanting to do something around these wild, crazy territory stories. So it was basically the three of us, $7, me and Jason and Chavo, kind of came together, developed the show back in 2019. We pitched it around everywhere, and then Vice came to the table. I think in like 2021, and then we decided right after season 3 we would go full time into making this.
Well, The Rock has always been for lack of a better word, a fan. And he'll say that he's a fan of wrestling and a fan of the territory days because that was his childhood. That's how he grew up. As folks know, for good and bad, he had, hard times where he was living with downtown Bruno eating toilet eggs in Nashville or whatever. But he, has a fond remembrance overall of those days and of the people in the business. And, I can see him wanting to spotlight that.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Oh, no, of course. And the fact that he grew up in it, he grew up in the territory system, going to these shows that his dad was at and, in Hawaii with his grandparents. So it's a huge part of his, upbringing, growing up in the territories and having aunts and uncles that were wrestlers,
Yeah.
Well,
he was very
ahead,
I was just gonna say, yeah, he was very inspired by the idea of doing something just on the territories and getting some of the old guys back together to to tell the stories. But even when I remember when we were in prep on the show, The Rock was devouring documentaries about that era. I remember him letting us know that he was watching the Memphis Heat documentary to just get inspired and get his head into it. So that was really cool.
Well, yeah, and as well, it's great to document some of these guys, not to be morbid, but after just the news about Antonio Inoki just yesterday.
Yeah.
But it's great to document these guys while you still can. And you sent me a preview of the first 2 episodes that are Memphis centric. One, Memphis generally, and second one, is kind of a special on Andy Kaufman and Jerry Lawler, the match, the rivalry, et cetera, et cetera. And if listening to these guys tell these stories, minus a lot more profanity, it sounded like when we used to sit around in the locker room in Memphis. It's the same. They're a little bit older, but with a lot of the territories, unfortunately, some of the greatest storytellers or the biggest stars or whatever have passed on, but you guys were able to get, for an entire list of these territories, everybody that you could that is still obviously around and cognizant. The list is, as I said, Memphis and Kaufman versus Lawler. You've got the AWA, Stampede Wrestling, Florida, Mid-Atlantic / Crockett Promotions, Portland, Polynesian Pro, World Class, and Mid-South.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a heck of a cross-section of really the 70s and 80s territories powerhouses. Who were you surprised at the most? Because you got an eclectic group for all of these roundtables.
Yeah,
and I guess we should say that's the format: is a bunch of guys around a table.
Yeah, no, yeah, we totally should, and that was what really makes it different, than Dark Side. Not just in the tone of just telling these, wild and crazy stories, as opposed to a sort of journalistic exploration of, tragedies or controversies in the business. This show is really kind of more celebratory in tone and looking at more of the just insane experiences of, territory wrestlers, some who have put their lives on the line, for the sake of the business. And for us, it was about getting wrestlers together to tell the stories, almost like a campfire style story time, with wrestlers, in kind of a Tales from the Crypt format, where it's an anthology show of these little 5 to 6, minute long stories that, they're just bouncing around. And that sort of was birthed out of I think it was one wrestling event I was at. I wandered into the hotel bar and I saw Road Warrior Animal, Scott Norton, Sonny Ono, maybe Medusa, and somebody else, and they had were a few beers in, and just sharing stories, bouncing. One would inspire another one, and the time that we were in Japan, and and so it would just ping pong around the table with these different stories, and every one was great. And so in the back of my mind, I was like, if you could capture this on TV, and it's hard because obviously I was just a fly on a wall for this very organic thing, and to put production behind it and try to recreate that is tough. But that's what we were trying to do with this show. And
I've always said the wrestling business is the only business in the world where when guys get together in their senior years, they say, "Hey, remember the time you broke my leg in Cleveland?"
Yeah.
Or
exactly.
I'm riding in a car with Ray Stevens one time. He said, "Let me tell you about the time I shot Don Fargo in the leg for a rib."
Yeah.
And
exactly.
you don't hear shit like that. But with the Memphis episode, obviously being my origination, I've heard a lot of these stories. As a matter of fact, that you reenact the Randy Savage Waffle House incident that Dutch Mantell, who is on the round table, has made famous in his book and has told it. And actually, I've heard it from a couple of different sides because it didn't make the final cut of your show. But Rip Rogers, my old friend and partner from OVW, was the guy that was with Randy that passed him the butter knife.
Oh,
because Randy said, "Give me a knife," and Rip reached down, hands him the butter knife. When they're at a Waffle House, it's not Morton's. You can't cut those fucking pork chops at Waffle House with a knife anyway.
Right.
But these stories again are all true, as I believe a famous movie intro once said, "Give or take a lie or two."
Yeah.
Now, this is the first time, I will admit, this is the first time that I've heard that Jerry Jarrett actually pulled Mario Galento's eyeball out and left it laying on the mat.
Right.
Because see, that's the thing is, again, we're not saying this is made up or manufactured. These incidents really did happen, but it's funny that everybody in wrestling has a slightly different way of telling it. Now, when Lawler wrote about it in his book, he mentioned that Galento had already lost an eye before with doing all the crazy shit he was doing, and Jarrett was going after his good eye. And he did get 200 and some stitches because he did get whaled with a with a billy stick on live television. And I believe, if I'm not mistaken, Tojo's wooden shoes may have come into it also. So they almost skinned Mario Galento's face off his head.
Jesus
But
Christ.
I never heard that the eyeball actually came out and landed on the mat. But that's what makes the story interesting, right? You never exactly know. And did they follow up the story? Because you left it after the straight and see, I'm going to give some teases here, folks. I'm going to give some teases. After the straight razor incident in Blytheville, did they go into Fargo calling him up on the phone?
They didn't go into that, but they went into some other story. He's like a Rasputin kind of character. He keeps coming back, and I think there was one other time. So he jumps Jerry Jarrett during the match. That's number one, and then Mario Galento, he comes back with the straight razor to attack Lawler. And then there was a third instance where Mario Galento and his wife, I think, were seen at another event in the crowd.
Smokey.
And he had a gun with him or something.
She had it. Because everybody knew. See, here's the deal. He married this girl and he didn't smarten her up. And her name was Smokey Galento. I can't remember what her given name was.
Smokey Galento.
Wow. But the boys knew, and it spread around, that she would sit front row and cheer him on in his matches for real, and she had a gun in her purse.
Amazing.
And then if things, it came out on more than one occasion, if she thought that he was getting a raw deal. And from what I can determine from people talking about Galento and reading his own publicity, and he authored his own autobiography or maybe told it to somebody. I'm not sure if he was that literate. I don't know that he was ever all the way smart to the business. And if he was smartened
Whoa.
up to the business the way that they conducted it in the Tennessee area back in the days before television, because he was a Roy Welch protege. So that meant you were barely smart because, most of the time, shit, as they mentioned with Galento, he would settle shit with a blackjack or the wife with the gun in the purse or coming at you in the parking lot or whatever. And
Jeez.
he was an odd case. But after that happened with them chasing Lawler with the switchblade, and then it was Jim White, by the way, Lawler's partner, in 1973 that put the big 357 Magnum in between Galento's eyes and said, "Get the fuck out of here." Well, Jackie Fargo hears about that, and he was Lawler's mentor, and Lawler was his protege, so he had known Galento for years. He called Galento up on the phone and told him that if he fucked with his boy Lawler again, he was going to kill him. Well, then apparently Galento called the cops on Fargo, and there's newspaper back and forth on the court cases between Galento and Fargo, for Fargo threatening to kill him. And it went on and on. Yeah, Mario Galento was there may be Dark Side of the Ring season 4 or 5 for you, because we know 4 is coming up.
Yeah, but well, I mean, there's a lot more to that story, and obviously, like I was saying, it kept going, and there was another story about Smokey Galento bringing the gun to the arena, and then somebody else got involved and put a knife up to Mario's neck and was like, don't you ever come back here again, because they thought he was going to attack the wrestlers again or something. Something like that. So, but obviously you only got so much time to tell it in the show. But what's really interesting, just to go back for a second, about that story and how the telling of these tall tales evolves over time, and that is a huge part of this show. And you're going to see it a lot in the season where, some folks at the table might be making some eye gestures or might be questioning some of the stories along the way. And I think that's part of the fun, because, I mean, these stories happened 40 years ago. They are road stories, war stories, and things do get exaggerated, especially in an environment where, folks at the table are going to be a little competitive with their stories in some cases. And I think that's fun. Like, for example, Jim, if you were at that table, if you were on that round table and heard the Galento story, would you have called out Jerry on those details?
Oh my God. How can I call out the god of wrestling, Jerry Jarrett? Here I am, this little diminutive Jim Cornette. No, I'd sit there and nodded if it was, in some cases you got to pick your fights, but right. I'll tell you what, though, I would have, because there was a story that Lawler told about road stories and ribs, and the Tennessee territory was ground zero for most ribs and road stories that involved driving and cars and things like that, because it was constant. It's 300 miles every day of the week, every et cetera, right? For 20 years, some of those guys. So they were the Fargos were masters of having naked midgets in a trunk at a toll booth. I mean, just anything to get a rise out of people. But the Kamala story, Lawler left one thing out, or maybe the editing did it. It's the punchline of the story.
No.
Y'all come on. Well, then he did for, I guess he figured, well, in this day and age, but here's the thing. He's got the blue light and he's got the loudspeaker, the megaphone or whatever, like the fire department uses. And he's pulled Kamala over on the side of the road in the interstate in Tennessee in the early 80s. And Kamala's riding by himself. And he's, okay, get out of the car. Now face away from the car. Back up toward me. That whole thing is true, right? But then what he left out was he starts frisking Kamala. And the Kamala's standing there. He's got this copy thing behind him. He's got his hands up. And the guy's frisking him around his ribs and then, around his pockets and everything. And then all of a sudden, Kamala feels the cop reach one hand between his legs and grab him by the dick and balls.
Oh, my.
And that's when Kamala looks down and says, oh, King.
Jesus Christ. Yeah, no, that was definitely not, that was not included in his telling of the story.
Yeah, he got some Ugandan headhunter there, but anyway, that's the thing, and especially the episode on the Lawler Kaufman program. A lot of people may think, because of the way that they look at wrestling these days, that, oh, that's bullshit. They didn't just do that week to week and just, hey, here's an idea. And no, that's what it was, especially in the weekly territories in those days. Every week it was improv. They felt it as they went. Mm-hmm. And there was such a lack of, I'm not saying there wasn't ever plans, but there was such a lack of minute, production of everything and just producing all the life and the energy and the spontaneity out of everything like today, that's why, people, more than whether the guys were good workers or more than whether the guys shit looked good in the ring, it looked so spontaneous because so much of it was that's why people could be swept up in it. Do you get that impression as you go back and look at today's product versus your research from these Tales of the Territories?
Oh my God. 100%. I mean, one of the things that's so cool about the Kaufman Lawler thing, and Jason, feel free to chime in too, is the idea of, yes, there's a lot of sort of Ocean's 11 planning going into this angle and sort of putting it all together, and it's very elaborate in some cases. But then in the same token, a lot of it's improv, and a lot of it's spontaneous, and a lot of it is feeling, in the moment of, really what's going to make this angle that much more real, or there's a lot of spontaneity with it, especially with when Lawler slaps Kaufman on David Letterman. He didn't even know he was going to do it until he did it. So there's a lot of elements of it that are just being in the moment and feeling out that storyline, and with that sort of agreement of, we're going to perpetuate this, at all costs, no matter what happens. And so I really appreciate that. And I think also what's great about this angle and why we kind of devoted a whole hour to it, which was not planned. That was something that was very organic and just happened on the fly, where we were filming with the guys for the Memphis episode. And I thought we were just going to get little pieces of the whole Andy Kaufman story that we'd be able to sprinkle into the Memphis episode. But then they just told the whole story from top to bottom. And then when we got back, I was like, oh my God, this could be a full episode. And for me, it's such a emblematic angle of the territories. It just speaks to so much of how elaborate it was, how much of it was improv, like I said. But it's just a great deconstruction of a great territory angle, and how far both parties, Kaufman and Lawler, took it, and kayfabe to the grave. I mean, you see when Kaufman died, when he passes on, they interview Lawler and he's like, well, it's always sad when people die, but I didn't like the guy very much, and he says that when the guy dies, and you never see that today. And I think that it speaks a lot to the art form. There's so much
honesty in that, because if that's really what happened and those two had felt that way about each other, that's really what you would say if you were being honest, right?
Oh, 100%. He has a great anecdote where he says, where Jerry Lawler says, if I hope when I die, they don't interview Jimmy Hart, someone who doesn't like me. I don't know why I'm commenting on this. It's great. It's awesome. But I think it's the art form, especially in the territory era. It's that art form of staying in the gray area, of blurring the lines and keeping fans there. Sometimes fans might think some of this is not altogether authentic, but if you can create the sense of doubt, and people aren't sure what's real and what's not. And I think that's the lost art form, especially comparing it to modern wrestling, in terms of that. So that was very eye-opening. I think very cool to see with that Kaufman episode.
Yeah, and look how far Kaufman took it to even not even smarten up his own parents to what was happening. Jerry Lawler talks about how Andy Kaufman's parents were so angry with him, and they thought that he actually broke Andy's neck. So yeah, just to see how far they would take it. Also, I love the moment. There's this moment Jerry talks about too with the David Letterman slap incident. Is that they had talked about the idea of Jerry slapping Andy on TV, but decided not to go with it. But when they were in the moment, Jerry just looked at Andy with just a look, didn't say anything, but they could just read each other's eyes, and you just get a sense that they knew, almost kind of this Jedi sort of feeling what was about to happen, and that created such a magical moment that it was a huge moment for wrestling, but it was just it was done in the heat of the moment, which is so cool.
Well, the thing is, the reason why, and I've always thought, and now that everybody's talking about this 40 years after the fact, because of its seminal nature in celebrities and crossovers and wrestling and everything. But Vince Sr. thought, well, this will make wrestling look phony and silly. And ultimately, it made more people believe wrestling, or at least something about wrestling, than anything else that anybody's done in the last 40 years. And case in point, with the average person, it happened in Memphis, wrestling obviously huge in Memphis. My cousin and his wife at the time lived in Memphis. And since I was still a photographer, when I would go down there, I would stay with them to avoid having to buy a hotel room, right? So that night, I shot the pictures of the match. I go back to my cousin's house, and his wife comes in. She was a nurse at the hospital that they took Andy Kaufman to that night. And she was the head nurse on the floor or whatever. And she obviously, I didn't sit them down and say, okay, here's the complete way wrestling works, right? I didn't smarten them up like that, but they knew, because they knew me and they saw what they saw on television. Okay, something's going on here. They were never wrestling fans. They knew it was obviously in some way choreographed or manipulated or whatever, but that's all they knew. But Terry, his wife, comes in and says, well, boy, they really hurt Andy Kaufman tonight, huh? I said, yeah, Lawler gave him the pile driver, 2 pile drivers. Everybody at the hospital bought it, because there had been Lawler on the local news, not the wrestling program, but interviewed on the local news saying, he's making fun of my business and I think I have to hurt him.
That's
and
amazing.
Then to begin with, it's a network TV star that's doing this to begin with. And then who in the world would think that a network TV star would go to the hospital if he didn't need to in Memphis?
True.
From a wrestling pile driver. So everybody bought it.
Yeah. And isn't there some truth to the fact of, like, because there's a little reference of it in the episode, when Jerry Jarrett talks about hearing from Bill Watts after Kaufman's in the hospital, Bill Watts talks to Jerry Jarrett on the phone and basically says, I'm so proud of what you and Lawler did to that, asshole who's making a mockery of our business, or whatever. But isn't there some truth to the fact that, like, they really had to work everybody, Jerry Jarrett and Lawler, everybody, and Kaufman had to work everybody in the business, because there was that stigma that if they did let everybody in on it, that it would have the appearance like, oh, this guy from the outside's coming in and he's going to make a mockery of our business, even if he is part of the angle. So we have to kind of protect it even from everybody in the wrestling business. Isn't there some truth to that?
Well, let's put it this way. I'm pretty sure as soon as because Watts saw the Associated Press or the national news or whatever that it got. It was in Sports Illustrated. It was everywhere the next day or two, right? That's before internet and even, wrestling news or any other kind of news, except in the newspaper or television, didn't move that swiftly. You had to talk to somebody on the phone or, wait for something in the mail. So my guess is that Watts was probably not happy a few days later or whenever he actually talked to somebody that was on the card that night, because all the boys at the time knew it was a work. It couldn't possibly not be a work in just in our world, right? They knew when Lawler set him down safe with a pile driver, it was a work.
Sure.
But at the same time, Andy wanted to play with it a little bit. And so then when he went to the hospital, they're like, did he really get hurt? But they knew the origination was a work.
Right.
But then they tried to keep the, the injury a little more mystifying. But as it got around the wrestling business, and remember, this is the days the guy still kayfabed. It wasn't like today where everybody has to go spill their guts on Twitter.
Right.
So most of the people in the business knew that Andy was working with Lawler and working in wrestling. It wasn't a complete shoot, especially when he came back after that. Now, the matches with the women were complete shoots.
Yes.
And so that was And even in the Coliseum, and even with Foxy, the rematch, they never smartened Foxy up. We talked about this when you guys were down here.
Yeah.
She really thought she had a chance. Lawler had pumped her up, right? She almost got him.
Yeah, I know.
But so that's the thing, is it was a gray area, but even the guys in the business were like, they didn't know the extent of how to which Andy would go to get this thing over, or to continue, or to prolong it. And because I guess you probably came away from a lot of these interviews with the sense that a lot of the guys in the particular territories, because of the nature of the beast in those days, had no idea what was going on in the other territories, because they were working 7 nights a week, doing their own TV once a week, in their own programs. There was no, as the boys started calling them, dirt sheets or the newsletters, until very early on in the 80s. There wasn't really a way to keep up unless you talked to other guys in the business in other territories. But then, the next generation got in, and video came along, and it was easier to keep tabs on people. But you've got an eclectic group for a lot of these episodes. Who are some of your favorite groups?
Oh man. Well, the Memphis group was great. I mean, everyone has such great chemistry, at that table. And that was a huge part of the show. Whereas Dark Side, you're doing these one-on-one interviews, and you don't have to rely on, one interview. You can always, rely on the storytelling of a lot of different voices and cut to them and whatnot. Making this show, it kind of lives or dies with the chemistry of the table, so it's kind of a high risk show in a lot of ways. So we really had to curate those tables, as best we could, in terms of, who's still around, but just sort of researching their stories ahead of time. We talked at length to everybody on the show well in advance before they actually appeared on the show, just to make sure we knew what stories we were going to get, and then to try and get all of the details of those stories so we could reenact them and things, and so on and so forth. And then it was also about who gets along with each other, because there's a lot of configurations in this episode, or a lot of different other people we could have had. But then I don't want to sit next to so-and-so, and I ain't talking to yada, yada, or whatever. So there was a lot of that to kind of play with. But my favorite, to answer your question, the Memphis group was great. I really loved the Florida group. I thought the Florida group was a lot of fun. It was Gerald Briscoe, who we've never had on Dark Side before or anything, so it was amazing to work with him. He's incredible. It was Kevin Sullivan as well. It was Steve Kern, Bob Roop, which was cool to have on the show, and Brian Blair. And those guys just had great chemistry, lots of stories batting around, a lot of stuff we didn't really account for, just because, sometimes there'll be just an organic story that'll pop out of nowhere that'll wind up in the show. And it was cool. And that episode has another great deconstruction of a pretty heated territory angle, which is the story between, taking real life and working it into the angle is the whole Bob Roop, Steve Kern conflict,
Yes.
Because Steve Kern has a father who was a POW, I think, in 2 different wars, which is insane. But his father, when he came home from Vietnam after being, a prisoner of war for, I don't know, whatever, 6-7 years, they of course worked that into the angle. They got Bob Roop to play the kind of almost Trumpian heel that is like, if you're a POW, you're a coward, or whatever. Yeah. And it created some real heat with the locals, because you had local military folks showing up in full fatigues, that were threatening to blow up Bob Roop's house with an anti-tank grenade. And I think he had a gun pulled on him in the parking lot over this. So that was cool, just to kind of get into that whole angle, something you don't hear about too much these days. And lots of funny rib stories. Obviously, Briscoe pulling some funny ribs on guys who were at the table, which is funny. And so that was just a great group of people for sure. The AWA panel was interesting, Jason. Wouldn't you say?
Oh yeah. That was one of my favorites, because we had Greg Gagne, Medusa, DDP, and Jim Brunzell, and one of my favorites, Ken Patera, who's quite the storyteller. But I think
character.
Yeah, that was like one of the first stories. His story, the infamous story of like Ken Patera is involved in with a boulder going through a McDonald's window one night after he was looking for some cheeseburgers after
I
a long bout of
understand
travel.
he happened to be driving by and saw that incident. Is that correct?
Yeah, right, exactly. And that's a great example of a story that, like as you said, everybody's off in different territories around the country, but I feel like that story made it around to every locker room in wrestling at that time, because it was in a lot of the newspapers, but it's definitely one of those lore sort of tall tales that everybody heard. I heard that the boulder was so and so big and all this happened, and he beat up X amount of cops. So that's a story that definitely has evolved over time.
Hey,
and that's
literally less than a year before that incident happened, he was down in Memphis, and they asked me to pick Patera up and drive him over to Jonesboro for the show on Saturday night, because he was in from out of town, didn't have a car. Okay, absolutely. And we're driving down the road, and I asked him one time, I said, Ken, I said, as strong as you are, I said, did your temper ever get the better of you? He said, oh, I've turned over a couple of Coke machines in my day, but nothing serious. And I swear to God, the next year he's going to prison.
Yeah, and that's an interesting dynamic at the table, because you'll see kind of everyone's reaction to his version of the story, which is fun. And yeah, it's a pretty crazy story, but it was a absolute pleasure, I will say, for Jason and I to build a full scale period accurate McDonald's facade, which we did for this show. And you don't get to do that all the time, every day. So that was fun, and we really threw a boulder through a real window in order to do this shot. So
Ooh,
yeah,
and we almost destroyed our camera too. It went through the window and then went through the plexiglass that we had in front of the camera, and it just smashed right into this camera.
Yeah, we almost destroyed like a $60,000 camera. But
it was worth it for this story, because it's a great story.
Was. It looks great.
You guys will pour any amount of money and sweat and blood into your art. You've got a Crockett Promotions roundtable, and with some interesting characters there, including, I think I remember Arn Anderson's on that one. David Crockett's a part of it, right?
Yeah, Baby Doll, and we also got Ricky Morton, first time in front of our cameras, which was great to have him. And we should also say, Jim, you as well, but you didn't quite make the roundtable trip, right?
Well, that's true. I mentioned that on the program last week. You did the roundtables in Los Angeles and Atlanta, and both of them are not Louisville, Kentucky. So I was not a part of that. But you have shot me.
Yes.
Filled me full of lead. You did. Now you've shot me, and also. But I said, let somebody else be the star on Vice TV for once. Heaven's sake, I can't just hog everything all to myself. But I've enjoyed.
I was going to say it would have been a crime, though, to not have you on a show about the territories. So we had to bend the rules a little bit for you.
Well, and I got bent, and I appreciate that. And I chimed in with a few things. But also I've enjoyed because I was a fan of all these guys on the Memphis Roundtable, and I was a fan of most of the guys on the other roundtables. Everybody mostly preceded me in the business. So I enjoy, also, as I mentioned, what I've been doing is helping you guys dig up some video. And I have thousands of pictures of odd people from various stages in the wrestling business. And we've been providing those. And I've enjoyed that too, because that way I'm contributing like I used to back in the old days when I was just a lowly boy photographer.
Incredible stuff of yours in there. Thank you for that.
Well, no worries. You'll get my bill later on. What's a surprise episode? I will say that, and obviously Polynesian Pro is near and dear to The Rock's heart.
Yeah.
For obvious reasons, but most people, especially the modern fans, may know the least about that promotion than they do these others because it's been covered less. So those stories may be new and shocking to the fans.
No, 100%. That's definitely feels like the deepest cut episode. And that was cool because we got Rocky Iaukea, who's King Curtis Iaukeia's son. And he tells, he puts the whole territory in perspective. brings a lot of the history to the territory, the lineage, of Peter Maivia, Leah Maivia. And we also got Lars Anderson on the show, which is great.
That's going to be great. That's going to be great.
Yeah, so it's cool to hear from him. He was kind of Leah's right-hand man for a while there, and he tells the story from his perspective of the FBI extortion trial that Leah was a part of, and how many close brushes with death that Lars had during that time, being beaten up and almost thrown into the ocean there a few times. And you also get to hear from Kevin Sullivan. Kevin Sullivan is we actually double dipped on him, so he's in two episodes on this series. He's in Florida and the Polynesia one because he spent, I think, almost a year in the territory. And we also had Downtown Bruno, who spent some time over there, and that's kind of how he forged his relationship that he has still to this day with Dwayne, but of course, Dwayne's family as well. And so that's kind of cool just to hear from him and his perspective. And he's a great guy, obviously, great storyteller. But there's a riot story. There's a fan riot story during this match between King Curtis and Neff. Is it Neff Maivia? Is that right? Is that what they call him?
Yes.
Right. Okay. Yeah. There was an angle between them, a match that was like, it's the craziest riot story I think we have in the entire first season here. So definitely stay tuned for that. That story definitely was like, holy shit. I don't know if you know that one, but that was crazy. So you'll hear from that.
A King Curtis riot story. You're going to have to narrow it down a little bit more, but we'll find out on the episode.
Yeah, exactly. And then of course,
did you reenact Mad Dog opening the door on the airplane in the AWA episode?
Well, of course. So that was great because you did a great interview with Greg Gagne a few years back, and that we saw that telling of it. He tells it very well on that interview you did with him, and that was another story that we had heard so many times in passing in other places, and we thought that would just be ripe for this show. That's like kind of the archetypal story almost for this series, it's a road story. You have Mad Dog Vachon, who has an entire pharmacy inside of him, at that point. And, he's been drinking, smoking weed, taking pills, and they got to get him on Vern's, plane to get him back home. And it was a low altitude plane, which is a detail of that story that gets overlooked because I think a lot of people are like, well, if he opened the plane door, wouldn't they all be dead? But it's not a pressure.
No, it's like
plane.
A private plane that the boys used to take in the 40 years ago, not a goddamn Delta 747.
Exactly.
See that's the great thing about these wrestling stories. Nobody disputes that this actually happened. The bone of contention is everybody that was involved or anywhere around claims that they gave Mad Dog something, and it was always something different, right? So nobody knows what he was really on or how many things or who really gave him something. Yeah. But the only disagreement is that everybody argues that they're the one that gave him the most potent, thing that fucking sent him over the edge.
Yeah. And Jason, you got to speak to this too, because it was so fun. We had a great actor playing Mad Dog, and we just went to town with that scene. And we actually got a Navajo chieftain. We got the actual plane, and we set it up on an airstrip. Go ahead.
No, yeah, we actually got the plane, and I remember like the guy we got it from was like very protective of it. Obviously, it's all a very old plane. But when we were doing the episode, like Greg happened to tell this story because when you bring up that plane, it's also nicknamed Suicide One, I think because of all the near-death experiences that have happened on it. But like Greg's telling that story of Mad Dog opening the door, and he finishes it, and he's like, "Oh, I got this other story. Oh, wait a minute, that's too much for television. I can't say it on television." And everyone's like, "Are you kidding? You got to tell this story." And so he tells a story of how they were up in the air, and Adrian Adonis like had to go number 2, like seriously bad, and they couldn't wait to land. And so Bobby Heenan's on the plane, and he gets the idea, well, what if I just stick a garbage bag up to your ass and you just, you go in that. And then he ended up having like explosive diarrhea that just shot everywhere. And that was I guess a little nerve wracking because we had to cover our actors and fake shit.
And this poor guy's playing.
Guy playing, obviously getting covered in it, and we're shooting leaf blowers like all around inside of it. So I haven't heard from the guy since, and maybe our production has, but sorry, buddy.
Yeah, we went to town with that plane for sure.
Yeah. Well, at least it was movie poop instead of real poop.
Wasn't shoot poop. It wasn't shoot poop.
Wasn't shoot poop. It was working poop. Holy mackerel. Well, boys, you've done it again. And hey, before we let you go, though, you got to clear up something else. Dark Side of the Ring Season 4 is being planned as we speak. Is that not correct?
Well, we can't give the official, wait for the press release wait for the announcement.
Ixnay.
That's okay.
Ixnay on the O'Shea.
Well, I don't want to get into trouble.
There's been a lot of people go, well, it was canceled. Well, it's been done away with. It's been buried as a time capsule under the Smithsonian. It's still breathing. It's out there breathing somewhere, ready to drop the strap and make a comeback when the time is right, right?
Yeah, because I think it's one of your lines where I think you say, how will they miss you if you don't go away, right?
Boom!
So I think for me it was like after season 3 we had territories lined up. It was like we knew we were going into that, and it would have been impossible to do both shows at once. Maybe now it would be more possible now that we've established what it is, because we're still trying to figure out what it is and trying to workshop setting up a whole new series. So we just decided that we wanted to devote all of our time to that and to getting it off the ground, making sure it was good, and and then we can probably create a factory around that show and then be able to make both series at the same time. So we took the time for that, and now we definitely have plans to get back into Dark Side. We want to. We're in the deal making sort of discussion phase of getting it officially off the ground, but there are talks right now. It's not going anywhere. We don't want it to go anywhere, at least. And so you'll probably hear very soon the future, the official future of Dark Side. Now I know when I say that, it's going to be all of your uncles and cousins blogs, wrestling blogs are going to be popping up here with Google alerts and everything that it's coming back. But
that's because everybody listens to us.
That's what I'm saying.
Yes. So temper expectations, ladies and gentlemen, but there's still some life in the old girl for right now.
Yes. It's very.
And we always got to be coming up with ideas for future episodes just in case.
Yes.
Love that.
Of course. Wink, wink. Yeah.
Wink, wink, nod. A wink's as good as a nod to a blind man. Well, nevertheless. But in the meantime, the show that we do have coming up that we got to watch, and thank goodness we have it to watch, because holy mackerel, the modern wrestling ain't giving us any enjoyment these days. But it starts this Tuesday, October the 4th on Vice TV at 10 o'clock Eastern Time. Tales from the Territories, from the production company of The Rock and the brains of Evan Husney and Jason Eisner. Episodes on Memphis, AWA, Stampede, Florida, Mid-Atlantic, Portland, Polynesian Pro, World Class, and Mid-South, with a cast of literally dozens. By the time you add all those up, probably at least 40. And Me Too.
More.
Yeah, close. Yeah.
More. There. Well, I'm bad at math.
Yeah.
But more, and Me Too as well, and you can't beat that with a stick. Guys, any closing thoughts on the program, or what you hope that the people will feel about it?
Oh, I hope people dig it, and I think the one thing for me is it's not definitive. Don't expect the Ken Burns approach to the history of the territories. This is a vehicle for crazy, wild stories. We definitely want to be able to come back to these territories in future seasons, especially Jim, wink, wink, nod, nod, where we can, do Memphis in season 2, all over again with a new host of people, different stories, or we can go to Mid-South again, tell a whole different bunch of stories. So it's just a vehicle to be able to get people together again, to have them share their stories. Hey, some of these wrestlers haven't been in the same room with each other in over 35 years. I think in the World Class episode, it was like Kevin Von Erich and Brian Adias hadn't seen each other like in 35 years or some crazy shit. So,
oh my God.
It's pretty cool. So, just enjoy it, have fun with it. And, we'll get back to our other business, very soon.
Well, you better. And I don't know why you're not doing all these programs at the same time. Every time I see you guys, you're just sitting around. You have nothing going on. You're not working hard at all. Nothing to occupy your time. Yeah. Anyway, Evan Husney and Jason Eisner, Tales from the Territories this Tuesday, Vice TV, and more Cornette on Vice TV will be coming up in the weeks to come, and we'll talk about that. And Brian, what in the world are we going to follow this with?